Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all as we continue our Sunday Forum series on the narratives from the Hebrew Scriptures. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Cho, who is Assistant Professor of Hebrew Scripture at Wesley Theological Seminary. He's been teaching there since 2013, so it's a pleasure to have you, Dr. Cho. Thank you.
Good morning. I have a handout that's coming around. If you it was about 2 or 3 months ago that Father Sean invited me to give this talk, and also invited me to provide a title for this talk. And I came up with The Call to Faith and the Long Response, the Case of Abraham. And I now realize that I could have just as well called it the Call to Obedience and the Long Response. And then we will talk a little bit about the interchange between faith and obedience. And as I also thought about Abraham as a figure in the long narrative of Genesis and of the Hebrew Bible altogether, I also realized that Abraham, to a certain extent, bridges the history, the primordial cosmic history that we find in chapters 1 to 11 on the one hand, and the history of Israel that will begin later in Genesis with Jacob becomes Israel, and of course Exodus. And so Abraham is this bridging character who bridges the universal, the cosmic implications of the Bible and the more particular history of a people. And I think the importance of Abraham, not only to Judaism, not only to Christianity, but also to Islam, and in fact to world history, I think reflects this bridging function of Abraham as a figure who both has a foot in the universal side of Genesis and also the particular side of the people, the history of Israel that is to follow. And so I have this week, and also the pleasure of joining you again next week, to talk about this larger-than-life figure who has had multiple and bifurcated legacies in our histories. And so I thought I would do two things. Next week, we will settle down and sit with chapter 22, Genesis 22, which Christians call the sacrifice of Isaac, and Jews more descriptively call the binding of Isaac, recognizing that Isaac is not in fact sacrificed. That will be next week. What I would like to do today is to provide an overview of the Abrahamic materials from Genesis 12 and to Genesis 22, and see if we can begin to understand the architectural beauty of the Abrahamic story, and to begin to kind of appreciate and to just wonder at the theological gems that are studied throughout the narrative cathedral that is the Abrahamic materials. And in order to do this, I am not going to begin with the beginning, but rather with a narrative that sometimes is overlooked. And this is the story that we find in Genesis 12, verses 10 to 20. And this is the first instance of when Abram, at this point, Abram is not called Abraham until his name is changed in chapter 17. When Abram colludes with his wife to pass her off as his sister. And if you begin there, kind of look at the implications of that, and then we will talk, and then from there we'll kind of build out the architectural plan of the Genesis story. So, the first text, this text number 1, so it's just Genesis 12, 10 to 20, but I'm just going to read 10 to 13. This should be in your handouts. Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to reside there as an alien, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know well that you are a woman beautiful in appearance. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account." I would assume that you don't hear many homilies or sermons about this passage, because it brings up a lot of ethical, moral, theological problems for many of us. The first and most obvious ethical problem is the fact that, well, Abraham comes up as a liar. He tells his wife to say, "Hey," commands her to say you are my sister, not my wife. But that's actually not the worst charge against Abraham that has been made. One scholar has, in fact, has gone so far as to say that Abraham is pimping his wife as a prostitute to Pharaoh in order to gain the benefits of that activity. Of course, there is some textual basis for saying this, for Abraham does say that say that you're my sister so that it may go well with me. Right? But I think this is an uncharitable and perhaps an unlikely reading of this text. And if we take into consideration the larger ancient Near Eastern context, we might actually be able to understand what Abraham was actually thinking. Because in the ancient Near East, in the absence of a father figure, the brother acted as the legal guardian and the legal protector of one's sister. So by saying that Sarai, who is actually his wife, is my sister, he was in fact perhaps trying to both protect his life by removing him from the rival list, potential rivals to Sarah's husband, and to protect also not only himself but also to protect Sarai from unlawful marriage by presenting himself as the legal guardian. So I think to a certain extent, the more condemnatory and reactionary readings of Abraham in this narrative is perhaps could be ameliorated by a more contextually sensitive reading. I should note that we don't know exactly what Abraham's intentions were, but I think it's more likely that he was trying to protect not only himself but also his wife, the future mother of the promised great nation. Remember, just a few verses prior, God has promised to Abraham that he will make Abraham into a great nation. I think it's more likely that Abraham was trying to protect his wife than to pimp her to any extent. So that's the ethical problem, and I think the ethical problem remains, but perhaps is qualified by our contextual knowledge. There's also the theological problems that some of us might have. The theological problem pits faith and works against each other and asks whether Abraham's flight into Egypt and his subsequent scheming represents a lack of faith on his part. If Abraham had true faith, the argument usually goes, he should have believed, instead of resorting to these stratagems, he should have trusted that God would protect him and his family and boldly walked into Egypt and declared, "This is my wife." Or better, if Abraham had true faith, he should have remained in Canaan despite the famine, trusting that God would be faithful to him and, in fact, see him through. So the question really at the heart of it is this: does salvation, does redemption, or being able to inherit the blessing of God, does it require faith alone, or does it require faith coupled with human works and human initiative and human creativity? And I would say that the Abraham story, and if you just look at the Abraham material, that the answer is somewhat ambiguous on this part. On the one hand, the promise and the covenant that God makes with Abraham are pure gifts, and their fulfillment at the end, the miraculous birth of Isaac, etc., come to fruition only by means of divine miracle alone. That is to say, human beings cannot make it come about. On the other hand, Abraham and Sarah intervene in a variety of ways throughout the story in their attempt to precipitate the fulfillment of the promise. And the most important example of this is perhaps Sarai's proposal to Abraham, that when she realizes that she is barren, and Abraham cannot have a son through her, that Abraham marry Hagar, her Egyptian slave, so that Sarai might gain a son through her. And this narrative is in Genesis 16. And we all know that the fruit of their labor is Ishmael. And though Ishmael is not the promised son, and he will not inherit the covenant that God makes with Abraham, he nevertheless received a stupendous promise, for he is promised to become a great nation on his own right. So in the story of Abraham, human works cannot and do not bring about the full fulfillment of divine promise. But human works also have a tremendously positive consequences, for they are shown to be able to extend divine blessing to Ishmael and to his descendants as well. And there is another theological, or perhaps if you prefer, a prophetic significance to the odd and cryptic episode of Abraham and Sarah's journey to Egypt. And I say prophetic because it has been noted that the basic plot of Abraham and Sarai's descent and exit from Egypt is analogous to the plot of Israel's descent and exodus from Egypt. If you just think at a more global plot level, both the ancestral couple and Israel go down to Egypt because of a famine. The lives of males, at least it's perceived that the lives of the males are threatened by the Egyptians, whereas the females are allowed to live in Egypt. Thirdly, because of this, there is a conflict between Pharaoh and God and Pharaoh, and God afflicts God and his household with great plagues, both in Genesis and also in Exodus. And after the confrontation is over between God and Pharaoh, the Pharaoh sends out both the couple as well as the people who have gained a great wealth in their time in Egypt. So the analogy between Abraham and Sarai's descent and exit from Egypt to the history of the Israelites, I think demonstrates the intimate intertwining of the destinies of Abraham and his descendants, the people of Israel. Abraham and Israel are shown to co-participate in each other's lives and sufferings. And this commingling demonstrates that whatever response Abraham manages to has to the call that he receives in chapter 12, it shows that that response is not sufficient. In fact, Abraham's response is only preliminary, and the full response will at least take the form of the people of Israel coming to faith and being obedient to God's call. So not only Abraham, but the people of Israel will need to respond to God's call, and whoever binds themselves, whether it is by faith, symbolically, or biologically to Abraham, must also respond to this call. The call requires a long response, at least through Abraham, at least in the life of the people of Israel, and perhaps, as we'll think about more next week, in the lives of many other people of faith. Those of you who are familiar with Genesis will also recognize that there is a literary problem with this episode of Abraham passing off Sarai as his sister. And it is that this pretty much the same exact event happens again. So if you turn to text number 2, this is Genesis 20, verses 1 to 2. And here it says, from there Abraham, now his name's changed, from here Abraham journeyed toward the region of the Negev and settled between Kadesh and Shur. While residing in Gerar as an alien, Abraham said to his wife Sarah, she is my sister. And King Abimelech, the Gerar of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. And of course, the same things happen. God afflicts Abimelech's household, and Abimelech gives back returns Sarah to Abraham. So scholars who are very interested in the history of composition of the book of Genesis have theorized that we have these two stories that are remarkably similar to each other, because what we have in the book of Genesis is at least two different source documents that are once independent from each other and contain many of the similar stories, but in different versions, and that these documents were combined to make up the book of Genesis. And so we had two different versions, so we had to preserve both, so we just dumped it in the same story. So that's the story. That's how the story goes. That I think has some merit. That hypothesis has some merit. But at the end of the day, we still have the canonical text that we need to interpret and have meaning for us. And so other scholars have taken the doublet, right, the telling of essentially the same story twice, as includes the structural plan of Abraham, the whole Abraham cycle. And they found that this wife-sister episode is not the only instance of a doublet in the book in the Abrahamic story. In fact, they found that virtually every single episode in the entire Abraham story has doublets, and that these doublets are, in fact, organized in such a manner as to form a chiasmus, which is to say, structurally, the plot goes A, B, C, D, and then it traces itself back, D, C, B, A. And that perhaps the intentional and beautiful way in which the stories are structured may in fact tell us how to interpret the story of Abraham. So what I want to do for the bulk of the time that's remaining is to actually kind of convince you that this chiasmus, this beautiful architectural cathedral, in fact exists in the narrative of Abraham. So if you go to, so we have right now, so you have the schema up in at the top of the handout. The wife-sister narratives are B and B prime. The next one that we'll look at is C and C prime. We are familiar with the story that where Abraham in Genesis 18 challenges God. God and two others or three others have come to visit Abraham, in part to tell him that he will have a son through Sarah. And of course, Sarah laughs, Abraham laughs, everybody is laughing. But right before he leaves, God leaves, God tells Abraham that he plans to destroy Sodom. The only problem for Abraham is that Lot, his nephew, now resides in Sodom. And perhaps also the fact that, and what also bothers Abraham is that perhaps there are righteous people who would be killed unjustly or inequitably when the entire region of Sodom is destroyed. So Abraham says to God, how about if they're 50? How about if they're 20? And he bargains with God all the way down to 10 lives. He says, "Oh, do not," this is text 3, "Oh, do not let the Lord be angry if I speak just once more." Suppose 10 are found there, 10 righteous people are found in Sodom. Then God answered, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy." So Abraham gets God to agree not to destroy Sodom if 10 righteous individuals are found in there. We all know that 10 were not found there, and God goes forward with the plan to destroy Sodom. But God also remembers Abraham, and because of his covenantal relationship with Abraham, God spares Lot and his family. So here is an episode where Abraham goes out to bat for Sodom and more particularly for Lot. And there is actually another episode, an earlier episode that we actually don't talk about very often, where Abraham, still Abram at this point, does pretty much the same thing. In chapter 14, we hear of a narrative, of a story where the kings of the League of Kings, which kings? A League of Kings, they come together and make war against Sodom and a few other city-states. They seem to have the upper hand, and they pillage Sodom. And in pillaging Sodom, they also take Lot, his family, his household, and his property as loot. So, and this is passage 4. When Abram heard that his nephew had been taken captive by this League of Kings, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318 of them, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Then he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his nephew Lot with his goods, and the women and the people. So this is not an instance where Abraham talks to God to save Sodom and Lot, but here is, in fact, a narrative where Abraham takes up arms against the kings in order to save not only Sodom, but of course in particular his nephew Lot. So we have in chapter 14 and then in chapter 18 and 19 a fairly parallel thematic passages where Abraham pursues saving not only Sodom but of course also Lot. So here we have C and C prime on that schema. And now the next example of the paired episode are the two accounts of God making a covenant with Abraham, which is followed by the annunciation and the subsequent birth of Abraham and Abraham's sons. And this is D and D prime. And I think I would like to point out that these episodes form the epicenter of the Abrahamic material. In other words, it's telling us that this is important, this is central to the entire story about Abraham. So Genesis 15, God makes a promissory covenant with Abraham. And when God appears to Abraham in a vision, Abraham, still childless, blames God for not giving him a child, but then looks at his servant Eliezer and asks, "Will Eliezer, my servant, be my heir?" In response, God says, this is passage 5, "This man shall not be your heir. Do not put, no one but your very own issue shall be your heir." He brought him outside and said, "Look toward heaven and count the stars, if you are able to count them." And he said to him, "So shall your descendants be." And he believed the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness. And what follows immediately from this promise is a covenantal, it's an act of covenant making, where Abraham splits animals into two, and a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passes through the middle. The pot and the torch represent, no doubt, God, And the act of passing through the cloven animals has the meaning of self-cursing. So God, in fact, places a curse on himself and says, if I break this covenant, if I am not faithful to this covenant, then I shall become like these animals. That is to say, I shall die. So God demonstrates, freely binds himself to covenant of faithfulness to Abraham in this way. And immediately following the scene of covenant making between God and Abraham is the annunciation of the birth of Ishmael and the subsequent birth of Ishmael. So the expectation at this point arises, is Ishmael, Abraham's very own issue, who will become his heir? As we know, this will not be the case. So what follows is another scene of covenant making. So in response to the narrative expectation, God appears to Abraham once more, and he says, "As for me, this is my covenant." Passage 6. "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You shall be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. Your name shall be Abraham. I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised." The second account of the covenant between God and now Abraham does not acknowledge the existence of the first. Like the two accounts of the wife-sister episodes, these two covenant accounts likely stem from two documentary sources. But in any case, unlike the first covenant, the second covenant stipulates that the covenant of people circumcised every male, and further notes that those individuals who are not circumcised will be cut off from the people. But that is not to say that this second covenant is conditional, because the covenant itself is eternal. Individuals may be cut off, but the people with whom God makes this covenant will remain. God will remain faithful, and since the covenant is everlasting, the bond between God and God's people will also be everlasting. So, as expected from the first account of the covenant making, what follows is the annunciation of the birth of Isaac, and then a delayed birth of Isaac. So, at the very center of the Abraham story, so D and D prime, are two acts of covenant making and two annunciations of two sons. And this tells us that, to a certain extent, the very heart of the Abrahamic tradition is this relationship that God freely makes with God's people, with Abraham. And I think this is perhaps the reason why all faiths, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, trace their relationship with God to in a variety of ways back to Abraham. Because Abraham, to a certain extent, mediates the relationship between God and God's people. And we also find that the birth of Isaac will be, to a certain extent, the culmination, the very beating heart of of the Abrahamic tradition. Isaac is, to a certain extent, very central. So we've filled out most of the structure, but I've left out the beginning and the end, the A and the A prime. I did this facetiously because, to a certain extent, these two episodes, the beginning and the end, chapter 12 and chapter 22, it's not as easy, perhaps, to see that they are the same or that they're continuations. But I would like to argue that Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 9, and chapter 22 are in fact continuation of the same story. That these two episodes, which frame the entirety of the Abrahamic tradition, is in fact tells us the entire narrative of the story. In Genesis 12, God calls Abram out of his homeland to embark on a journey of faith and obedience with a promise of incredible blessing. And I would argue Abraham fully responds to that call and comes to the end of this journey of obedience and faith only when in Genesis 22 he arrives at Mount Moriah to sacrifice his son Isaac. The journey of faith and obedience that Abraham begins in 12, in fact, takes a long time. It only comes to a conclusion with chapter 22 when he arrives at Mount Moriah. So text 7, in Genesis 12, God, unmotivated and seemingly out of nowhere, calls Abraham. God says, "Now the Lord said to Abraham, go forth." The Hebrew is lech lecha. That exact phrase appears only twice in the entirety of the Hebrew Bible. So lech, go, would have been sufficient, but here it is lech lecha. Go forth from your country and your kindred and your father's house to land that I will show you. That's Genesis 12:1. As we know, in response, God leaves his homeland and becomes an immigrant, an exile, if you will. He heads towards a foreign land, toward a land God has promised, but has not yet shown him. Right? Go to a place where I will show you. Right? But this journey, as it turns out, does not end in Canaan, in the promised land. For God, toward the end of Abraham's life, will call him once again in diction that echoes the first words to Abraham in Genesis 12. God will, for the second and only time in the entire Bible, command Abraham to go forth, lech lecha, and once again send Abraham to a place God promises to, but does not immediately show. This is passage 8. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go forth, lech lecha." Second time and the only time in the Hebrew Bible that locution appears, to land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I shall show you. So when God called Abraham out of the land of his homeland, Abraham responded in quiet faith and resolute obedience. He left and headed toward the land God is always in the process of showing him. At that time, Abraham could not and did not suspect or imagine that his faithful response of obedience would consume all of his life and all of his energy. After the miraculous birth of his and Sarah's son Isaac, when Abraham could see with his own eyes the coming fulfillment of God's promise of long ago, that is to say, when Abraham was just settling down and becoming happy, God calls him again, and again sends him out from his home toward a place God is always in the process of showing him. This time, he sends him there not to inherit a vast land or with the promise of numerous descendants, but God sends him to an unknown land to sacrifice the child of promise. Not to receive a blessing, but to let it go. And not to let it go only, but in fact to sacrifice his son, as God reminds him, his only son, Isaac, whom he loves. So as we know the end of this story, Abraham binds Isaac to sacrifice him. But before Abraham can sacrifice him, an angel binds Abraham's hands to prevent him. And this act of obedience, to a certain extent, is the culminating end of Abraham's long journey in response to the call that he received at the beginning in chapter 12. And as we indicated, this response will have to continue, not into the lives of the people of Israel, and as we'll have a chance to look at next week, by Christians and by Muslims and many peoples of faith. So we'll look at chapter 22, where we ended next week, and many reverberations that this story has for many people of a variety of faiths this week. It's almost time, so thank you. Yeah.